Today, I'm going to be speaking with Michael Oren. Michael served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2013. He is the author of many books, but most famously, the New York Times bestselling Power, Faith, and Fantasy and 6 Days of War, June 1967 and the Making of the Modern Middle East. He recently released his first 2 novels, To All Who Call in Truth and The Night Archer and Other Stories. Forward named Ambassador Oren one of the 5 most influential Jews in America, and the Jerusalem Post listed him as one of the 10 most influential Jews in the world. Most relevant to this podcast, Michael was a lone soldier long before that was trendy. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Great to be with you, Corey. Great honor.
So you drafted into the IDF in 1979, and I'll start with the same question that I ask all of my guests, which is, why did you decide to do that?
Oh, I wanted to do that since I was a kid. I knew from a very early age that I wanted to live in Israel. I knew that to live in Israel, you had to be in the Army. For me, being in the Army meant being in the paratroopers, so I insisted on going to the paratroopers. It wasn't easy. They threatened to throw me in jail a couple of times. I insisted on going. So it was an important step for me, and it's been important. I actually stayed in the Army off and on for many years, altogether about 35 years of engagement with the IDF.
That's awesome. And tell me a bit what it was like to make Aliyah back then, before there was a process.
Before there was anything.
Yeah.
Before there was anything. This place was the Wild West. I mean, there wasn't any place to eat. There was falafel, and that wasn't particularly good falafel. I was just telling somebody back then that back in the 70s, there wasn't central heating in Israel. So you had to go to a gas station with 2 big jerry cans and fill it up with kerosene and come back and light your kerosene lamps. So there's never enough hot water. And one of the big problems of being a lone soldier was that the IDF back then, you didn't shower in the Army. You could go 2-3 weeks without showering. You come home filthy, black in the face. They also didn't exchange uniforms the way they do today. So you'd bring home all your dirty uniforms, and there was never enough hot water, both for me taking a bath and washing my uniforms. So I would fill a bath with hot water, put my uniforms in there, and then me get in there and sort of slosh around in the black water. It's hard to imagine this today. It wasn't easy.
Yeah, I mean, we complain about not getting off base enough, but showering was not one of the things that I thought would ever be a problem for me. So I did a year of training in Devon, so I did my basic and advanced training on the paratroopers training base, and I know you were in the paratroopers as well. Tell me a bit about what the tryouts and training were like back then. I think you wrote that you were hospitalized for a week after the Gibush.
Yeah. Today, there's a whole set of rules and restrictions on the training that you can't do. But this was before that. Today, I don't think you can do a Masa Kumta, your march that you do for your beret. How many kilometers did you do, Corey?
I think it was like 70 kilometers or something.
Yeah, that's pretty much the outer limit. I did 135 kilometers. I walked for 48 hours straight. You can't do that today. Today, on a Thursday night, you have to get a full night's sleep. Now they've actually upped it to 7 hours. We never, ever slept for a second on Thursday nights. And we didn't usually get more than 2-3 hours a night sleep. Now you have to get 6 hours a night sleep. So it was very, very rough back then. It was an extremely poor army. It was in the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. There weren't enough uniforms. The big thing was to have American pants from Vietnam and Soviet shirts. The Soviet shirts were really cool. And there wasn't a lot of food. And one of the big talents I developed back then was stealing food and cooking food, because we used to cook our own food. We didn't have cooks. It served me well. I've learned how to cook because of the Army. And always cold. The first year that we were in paratrooper training, they would not let us wear jackets in the winter or gloves. So you can think about this today. Today you go to jail for something like this.
Well, at least in 2010, when I was in, that was also the case in basic training. We were not, during the day, we were not allowed to wear any warm clothing.
Anything.
Yeah.
But sucked. They also used to hit you and kick you and throw stones at you. And I've been smacked more times than I can count by a commander. You can't do that today either. The whole idea of what was called tilturim, these like kind of punishments that they would do. We had one that was famous. It was raining, it was the middle of the winter, and the commander came in and says, okay, they call them Mizdar Amerikai, an American drill. And you had to take everything on your back, everything, all your kit bags, even your beds, and run around the entire encampment. So we run around the entire encampment, and every time you got there and you were a second late, he made you run to the showers and shave. Now, this is before the days of, nice Gillette razors, but you actually had a razor blade that went into the razor, and you'd shave and shave. Then he'd walk around with a credit card and go like this, and if it made a noise, he'd make you do it all again. So this went on for hours, and eventually it didn't make a noise because our faces were all bloody, and and every one of these these punishment sessions used to end with the same thing. Are there any questions? If someone get up there and say, "You're crap. You're worse than crap. You're worse than bird crap. You're worse than worm crap." They give you this whole thing. You'll never make it in the paratroopers. Then they'd say, "Are there any questions?" And me being older and being stupider, I would always raise my question. I always raise my hand. And that particular night, I raised my hand, and I said, "I'm a fakid, sir. What did we do wrong?" He said, "What do you mean? What did you do wrong?" Well, I said, "Sir, maybe I'm missing something, but I always thought the purpose of punishment was to educate." And he looked at me and says, "You got it all wrong. The purpose of punishment is to punish." And I think at that moment, I understood that I was in the Army.
That is an amazing introduction to my friend's father put it best. He said the reason that there are guards stationed outside of military bases is to keep reason out. And I think there's some merit to that.
The purpose of punishment is to punish. Like all of a sudden, what they say is Nafalia Simon. I finally understood what it was to be in the Army. Don't look for reason on anything.
Yeah, and the punishments were always harder than the planned workouts, I found. I mean, is there any particular like training exercise or punishment other than that one that like sticks out to you as one of the worst?
Yeah, because I was the tall guy. I was the tallest guy. He was really kind of short, and paratroopers were even shorter. And I was almost 6'3", and I was always on the receiving end. So they had a thing called Khatan Bakala. I don't know if you know this, but Khatan Bakala is bride. You had to be the bridegroom. I was always the bridegroom. You had to hold the guy in your hands like this for I don't know how many minutes, endlessly, and not let him down. If you let him down, it got worse. So it's amazing that I have a back at all after all this stuff.
I was going to say that sounds miserable.
Pretty miserable. I don't think it was the worst. I don't think it was the worst. Khatan Vakala was definitely a bad one.
It's funny, the stories get passed down from generation to generation, but we don't get to hear the ones from yesteryear. The ones that came from the 70s and 80s. And I think every class of paratroopers believes that they have it harder than the ones that come after. But after hearing these stories, I can unequivocally say that you definitely had it much worse. Do you feel that the training changed you in any way?
Yeah, it made me a soldier. And I got to say that, the fact that there was sleep deprivation, constant sleep deprivation, the fact that you were constantly filthy, constantly hungry, kind of short on ammunition. We were stealing ammunition all the time. Big thing was to raid the other unit's ammunition dump. And that prepared you better than anything else for war, because that's just what war was like. And I've been in several, and this is exactly what it was like, especially the first Lebanon War in 1982, and where I went with sleep probably for about 10, 11 days. Of course, I didn't shower for a couple of weeks, was hungry. I'll never forget getting to Beirut in 1982 and going actually into a Lebanese restaurant and buying a falafel with shekels. They were perfectly happy to take our shekels. But that was like the first meal I'd eat. There's no food.
That's wild.
Yeah.
You actually wrote, and I know that at the end of your service in 82, you were in Lebanon, and beyond the physical hardships, there were emotional hardships. I know tragically your officer was killed in an ambush and your teammates were wounded. Can you tell me about the experience of actually fighting in that war?
Yeah, what they teach you in training is the war is nothing like what you see on TV. Usually, if someone's shooting at you, you have no idea where they're shooting it from. In movies, someone shoots at you, you immediately shoot back. But that's not the case. Bullets are flying. You have no idea where they're coming from. Especially in a land state like Lebanon, mountains and villages, you don't know. And there are parts of that experience that were sort of right out of Apocalypse Now. I'll just give you one of many, many stories. We were coming through a village, probably a Druze village that had just been liberated, and buildings were still on fire, and they were having a big celebration on a porch. Bunch of tribal leaders, and there's lots of food, mounds of food. They were offering us food. We weren't supposed to take any food from villagers, but we declined. And as we drove along in the Nagmash, the APC got to the end of the porch. At the end of the porch, there was a pile of body parts that they apparently belonged to the enemy, and these guys were celebrating the dismemberment of their enemies. And then you realize, like, you're not in Israel anymore. You're in a radically different universe called Lebanon, called the Arab world. Very, very different.
Yeah, I would say, I understand that you actually went back to Lebanon the day after you got married. And, I always
Yeah.
marveled during my service at the distance between civilian and soldier. You'd be doing a training or a dangerous mission, and then a few hours later, you're in Tel Aviv, and it's like there's no conflict. So how did you switch back between those two worlds in such an extreme case? I mean, this is probably the most extreme case, right? That the best day of your life in the form of your wedding, and then maybe the worst in the form of a war.
Yeah, and today also you have to get 10 days off from weddings today. Now that's also a law. You can't get called on the day after your wedding anymore. But and then I did it for many, many years. I mean, I probably spent all told about a year of my life in Lebanon, because I was in Lebanon through the 80s. And then the 80s ended me right into the first Intifada. And the first Intifada went into the second Intifada. And then we went into things like the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. Then right after that, second Lebanon War, and then the Gaza War. So it was pretty much, you always gone back and forth. What was weird about Gaza in particular, because it's like 45-minute drive from my house. So I can almost see Gaza from my porch. So I'm in southern Tel Aviv here, and Jaffa. So it was very, very bizarre. What can I say? Do you get used to it? Yeah, you sort of get used to it. Probably the less, I would say, exalted aspect of this is you get kind of addicted to it. And if you like skiing, if you like, action sports, body sports, there's nothing like war for an adrenaline rush. Churchill once said it famously, that there's nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at and missed. And I've been shot a lot, but frankly, I've been missed. Did not happen to my son. My son was shot at and hit, and that was a big one.
Yeah, I read about that. And I know after, it didn't end for you with your service. After your service, you worked with the Zionist underground in the former Soviet Union. How did you get involved in that?
Well, they were looking for people who had 2 passports, and they're looking for people who came out of combat units. So I kind of fit the bill. And I've been involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, all through my youth. So it was really 2 weeks after I got out of the army, and my feet weren't dry. But how could I say no? And it was during a terrible period of the Cold War. It was Brezhnev was the premier in the Soviet Union, clamping down the Jews. All the Jews in the underground were going to Siberia earlier or later. And so I left with a friend of mine I'd been to college with, who had also been in the Golani Brigade. And we went as a group. Now, the state of Israel was sending people all the time. And it's a great chapter in Israel's history, because the state of Israel was sending people to do many things, to bring teaching materials, to bring genes to be sold on the black market, but mostly just to remind these underground groups that were under tremendous duress that the state of Israel had not forgotten them, and that we were with you, and someday we're going to get you out of it. And it's hard. I talk to groups of young American Jews and remind them that when I was their age, they were, a large segment of the Jewish people was behind bars, was not free. 3 million Jews behind the Iron Curtain. And you couldn't be passive in the face of that type of outright hatred and oppression of Jews.
Now, I know you were arrested many times there. Did you fear for your life? What drove you to keep going?
Oh, did I? You're 10,000 miles away from home. You can't tell anybody who you are. You got a cover story. I was an American journalist, and you're getting, roughed up, body searched by the KGB. These guys are huge and mean and anti-Semitic, and there's nowhere you can go. There's no escape. I was afraid. What was amazing, I drew strength to the degree I could do anything. I drew strength from the leaders of the underground, who were fearless. Some of them were young women, maybe 5 foot tall. Amazing. You talk about, the heroines of Jewish history, the women who led the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. I saw it firsthand. These people were literally the most courageous people I've ever seen in my life.
And I know you mentioned in your book Ally at one point, kind of coming face to face with someone that you had met in the underground and having this kind of silent moment of recognition. Were there times
still?
That was Phil?
I don't remember them that well, but they remember me. But it just goes to show how important it was that someone came from Israel and risked themselves, to make that contact. So I was one of many hundreds. I don't know how many people did this, but they don't forget them. And my initial point of contact in Moscow was a 23-year-old, fearless, handsome, brash young man named Yuli Edelstein, who is currently, well, he's currently in the opposition, but he was the speaker of the Knesset, great speaker for Knesset. My first act as a member of Knesset was to vote for Yuli Edelstein being the speaker of the Knesset. How about that one?
That's awesome. That's
awesome.
That's really cool.
That is
So
very cool.
fast
I agree.
forwarding a couple decades, you participated in the disengagement from Gaza in 2006. And for those listeners who don't know, in 2006, Israel attempted to trade land for peace and forcibly removed 9,000 of its citizens from the Gaza Strip. So can you tell us what that was like from your firsthand experience?
Yeah, of all the training I went through, all the wars I went through, all the time in Russia, nothing was harder than disengagement. It was the largest Israeli military operation since the war. It was 55,000 soldiers in concentric circles. I was on the inner circle, innermost circle, which means we actually went into the houses and pulled people out, and screaming, crying, kicking. We were crying, they were crying. We at the end of every yeshuv that was cleaned out, everybody stood and sang a tikva and tried to hug one another. It wasn't easy. I have a bit of a bitterness about it, in the sense that if you were in the regular army, you got psychological support. But if you were a reserve officer, you got no support. So I just came home after that without having talked to everybody or shared the experience with anybody. It was very traumatic.
I imagine. And I do think the IDF today is doing a much better job of caring for the mental well-being of its soldiers. It's not perfect by any stretch, but there certainly is a growing recognition of the need to help folks, both reservists and active, address these issues that went untreated and unspoken about for so many years. So stepping away from your direct experiences in the military for a little bit, I think many people, myself included, before I read your books, had the impression that you had this linear journey from military to academia to politics. And in fact, the road was not easy. Yeah. At times you wondered if you could provide for your family. And you said once that you weren't much of an athlete and that you were a three-letter man, but those three letters were ADD. And
right.
as someone who has ADHD, I can certainly empathize with that. I also had learning disabilities growing up. And I wonder if you think that
this is my favorite award as ambassador behind me. You get a lot of awards as ambassador. This is my favorite. It's from the Lab School of Washington. It's given to the learning disabled individual who has achieved the most in life. And the guy who got it with me was this guy called Joe Biden. And
that is really cool. Wow.
I love it. I keep it right behind me just to remind me.
That is really cool. Well, yeah. So I guess my curiosity is, do you think that learning to overcome academic obstacles at a young age taught you to push through when others would have stopped? I mean, you were told to, you were urged by many people to stop writing before you published 6 Days of War. So were your learning disabilities strengths in the end?
You may remember, if you went into the Army base, there was a sign that said, "Kasher b'imun, kal b'krav," right? It's hard in training. It's going to be easy in battle. It's bullshit, of course, but it is true about life. I mean, if you get the crap beat out of you often enough, as a kid, you get tough. And, I grew up as the only Jewish kid in a working class neighborhood. And I was often being beaten up by the anti-Semites. My father had been a career officer in the US military. Had landed on Normandy and fought through World War II. He was a tough guy, very tough guy, very courageous man. I had to deal with the learning disabilities. I didn't have money, so I started working when I was 15 and worked all the way through college. I usually held several jobs at a good time at college. So by the time, I got to Israel in the 70s, what would seem today to be, insurmountable difficulties and deprivations wasn't so bad for me. And it really was. And I arrived here with a backpack. I'd come with a container. Literally everything I had was on my back. And it was cold and it was tough. But I think I had been very well prepared for it. Even academically, I'd gone to a very, very tough university and prepared that way. And yes, writing. I had started writing when I was 12, and I was rejected by the time I was 13, and then I was rejected when I was 14, 15. And I had some successes, which enabled me to, even get accepted to college. I published poetry and made a film, but it toughens you. It just does, and it certainly makes you ready for politics.
What advice would you have for young folks who might be struggling with learning disabilities about how to get through that?
Well, first of all, embrace them. Understand that you may do things different than other people. You see out of the box. And I think that my learning disabilities are very much are linked to my energy and to my creative energy. And embrace them. They give you certain advantages that other people don't have. But other than that, learn to get around them. They're just disabilities, and you get around them in different ways. Everyone has their own way.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about Israel today. I very much agree with something that you said in a pretty hostile interview by the New Yorker. And the quote was, "Giving up parts of what you call the West Bank and we call Judea and Samaria does not mean that it doesn't belong to us. It just means that there is another people who also say it belongs to them. And if we are ever going to reach a compromise, we're going to have to make concessions. It's recognizing reality." So, I couldn't agree with that more. I think before I ask you about the way forward, maybe give listeners some historical context about Judea and Samaria, just so they can understand kind of where our starting point is as it relates to that.
Judea and Samaria, what most of the world calls the West Bank, was an area that had been allotted to the Palestinian state under the UN partition resolution of November 1947. The Jordanians occupied it after Israel's War of Independence. It remained in Jordanian hands for 19 years. It was used as a launching pad for attacks against us. Both the West Bank and the eastern part of the city of Jerusalem were in Jordanian hands. Essentially, Jordan before that was called Transjordan, but then it was on both sides of the Jordan, so it became Jordan. Nobody recognized Jordan's annexation of the West Bank except for Britain and Pakistan. And in the 1967 war, the Jordanians attacked us. We didn't attack them. And as a result, Israeli forces liberated Jerusalem, reunified Jerusalem, and captured Judea and Samaria. And subsequently, Israelis began to settle there. Today, about 400,000 Israelis live there, probably closer to 500,000 today. And these are the lands of our Bible. This is actually the cradle of our civilization. Tel Aviv is not in the Bible. Well, it's not in the Bible. It's a Jewish city. It's actually a town in Babylonia, believe it or not. It's called Tel Aviv. There is no Tel Aviv. Where I'm sitting here in Jaffa was pretty much a Philistine area. All the 8 great battles of the Hanukkah story were fought in what is today the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. That's where we're from. We're hill people, and we're hillbillies, and we're not coastal people. And that is our homeland. It's our ancient homeland. I go further than what I said in that article, which was I believe that every millimeter of the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel and the state of Israel. That doesn't mean that if we ever get into a negotiation with the Palestinians, we may have to give up something because they also view every millimeter. It's also a smart negotiating position. We shouldn't go to the negotiating table where they say 100% is theirs and we say 60% is ours. It's bad negotiation. But I also believe it. It's not just a negotiating position. I mean, if I don't have a right to sit in Hebron, then I have no right to sit in Jaffa. It's the exact same right. Actually, I have a little bit more of a right to sit in Hebron. And so I've been a strong supporter of Jewish settlement in Hebron for that reason. But I'm also a person who's open to concessions. It's not going to happen, not because of us, because the Palestinians, A, don't really want a state, and B, are not going to actually pay the price, and there's no Palestinian leader who's going to be able to do it, as far as I can see. I have been involved in the peace process. I was an advisor to the Rabin government. I was an advisor on the Trump peace plan. I've been involved in every single peace plan since the early 90s. And I've come away with a couple of basic conclusions. One is that your position on the peace process, especially if you believe in the two-state solution, is based not on reality, but based on belief. It's a religious belief. It's not based on facts. And that it's, while we can say we support the two-state solution in theory, in practice, I wouldn't bet on it.
Well, rolling back the clock a little bit, you are the premier historian, as far as I'm concerned, on the 6-Day War. Talk to me a little bit about the aftermath of that war and what exactly Israel offered and to whom back then before these lands were resettled.
Well, Israel almost quadrupled its size. It conquered the Sinai Peninsula, which itself is almost 3 times the size of Israel, the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem. And right after the war ended, Israel offered to give back the Sinai and offered to give back the Golan Heights to Egypt and Syria in exchange for peace agreements. We offered to enter into a peace arrangement with Jordan, more complex there, because that border, our border before 1967 was only 8 miles wide at the Judean Samaria point near Netanya. But the Arab response was the three no's of Khartoum: no peace, no negotiations, no recognition, and it didn't work. It didn't go anywhere. So Israel began to settle in the Golan Heights. The first actually settlement was a left-wing kibbutz. Maybe you wouldn't see that so much today. Maroma Golan, those of you remember Maroma Golan, in Jerusalem, in Hebron in 1968. Back then, the settlements were not considered illegal by the United States. There was a finding by the Johnson administration that actually Israel had the most right to settle in those areas because they had never been legally annexed by the Jordanians, and these areas were acquired in a defensive war. So, that is what we offered after '67. It wasn't accepted.
So speaking of Judea and Samaria, people are fond of saying end the occupation. And Israel has made many peace offers, as you alluded to the Palestinians. And the most recent, in 2008, President Omer offered to create a Palestinian state in Gaza, almost all of the West Bank, half of Jerusalem. And that plan was supported by the US, Russia, the EU, the UN, and Abbas didn't even bother to respond. In theory, the best way to end the occupation would be to pressure the side that has rejected several offers instead of the side that is putting these offers on the table. But in practice, do you think pressure or accountability would actually make a difference?
No, I don't think. First of all, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, really doesn't have the authority to make peace. He hasn't held elections in 15 years. He's not going to make. He's not going to make peace. He doesn't have the support of his own people. Doesn't have the authority. If he did it, he'd probably be killed. So it's sort of a non-starter until you actually have a Palestinian leadership that's capable of doing this, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. Palestinian politics keep on fragmenting, not unifying. And it's just more than that. You just cannot end an occupation and say, okay, here's your state. And we saw what happened in Gaza. We mentioned the withdrawal from Gaza. We withdrew from Gaza. We ripped up 21 settlements. We gave the Palestinians a chance to have a mini state. And within a very short period of time, the Fatah forces were overthrown by Hamas, and we had a terrorist state. We can't afford to have that happen. In the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I look out my back window. I'm in Jaffa, but I see Judea and Samaria from my window in Jaffa. And if I can see Judea and Samaria, some sniper there can see my window in Jaffa. So it's zero area. I mean, even our airport is right beneath that. So we can't afford to have a Hamas state there. Cannot. And there's no Palestinian leader that is going to forfeit control of its airspace to Israel, that's going to forfeit the control of its major security envelope to Israel. And yet without that, we can't exist.
Yeah. And, most of the solutions that have been proposed require Israel to trade, land for peace. And as you point out, that trade has not been a successful one to date. What would a potential compromise look like, and how could things be done differently to get different results?
I like the Trump peace plan. It was a much smaller Palestinian state, but Israel also swapped territories with it. And there were a lot of conditions put on the state. One was that they have democratic elections, one that they give up the claim for return of Palestinian refugees. There were some crucial points to this. And they rejected it out of hand. People say, oh, they rejected the Trump peace plan. But I have to remind them that for 8 years during the most pro-Palestinian presidency in American history, they also refused to join negotiations. So it wasn't just about Trump. It was about refusing to join negotiations. People forget that. I think that we have to learn to manage this conflict better. To a certain degree, there already are two states. If you drive up our number 6 highway, you pass Tulkarm and Kalkia in the West Bank, you see large Palestinian flags. They're not flying over nothing. There's a police force there. They collect taxes. They patrol the streets. They would have elections if the Palestinian Authority would let them have elections. So there is kind of a state. It's not a Weberian sovereign state the way we understand sovereignty, but we could enter a negotiation and expand and define that sovereignty much better, much better. I don't see that happening. So we have to learn to manage the conflict much better. And we do it for various ways. I spent a year and a half in the government being in charge of the Palestinian issue. And I was proud to say that we were able to get to the point of where 170,000 Palestinian workers were entering Israel legally every day, waiting for the most part, very short period of time, about 5 minutes to get into Israel. And that's pre-Second Intifada levels, very high. So we already have a significant degree of coexistence, but no one's ever interested in writing about it because it's too positive. And the degree that Israel presented, I presented a number of development projects for the Palestinians of the West Bank, and the PA turned them all down. PA turned them down because they don't want to normalize what they call the occupation. So they're willing to have their own population suffer. You saw what happened with the vaccines. We offered them vaccines. They turned them down. So they'd rather have their people die of COVID than take vaccines from Israel. That is classic Palestinian mentality, at least of their leadership.
And you touched on something that I want to dive deeper into, which is what it means to actually be pro-Palestinian. You know, like you, I've spoken in front of.
I don't understand, because the people of pro-Palestinian, I would ask them, do you know anything about the Palestinians? Do you speak their language? Do you know anything of their history other than that they are victims and who they are victims of? So you're pro-Palestinian. What does it mean? Pro-Palestinian art, pro-Palestinian architecture, pro-Palestinian history. What history do you know? I mean, ask them. Ask what they know what Tulkarm is.
Let's take AOC for an example, right? She says Israel's an apartheid state, but can't name a single apartheid law. So let's give you this example. You're in a room with AOC and suddenly she genuinely wants to be pro-Palestinian. What would you tell her? What are the real issues the Palestinians are facing?
You want to be, I'd say, listen, you want to be pro-Palestinian? Tell the Palestinians to enter into negotiations with us. Tell Palestinians to stop their educating their kids to kill Jews. Tell the Palestinians that the refugees aren't coming back, you know, the pre-67 Israel. Tell the Palestinians if they really care about their children and their grandchildren and want a better future, this is the way to do it. That the current way, being pro-Palestinian, is enabling them to remain where they are, which is nowhere. All right. For example, if you in favor of giving aid to UNRWA, the relief agency for the Palestinian refugees, which perpetuates a refugee problem. It educates kids against peace. UNRWA is probably one of the single greatest obstacles to peace in the entire area between us and the Palestinians. It's extraordinarily, unspeakably damaging to the Palestinians themselves. The people who think they're pro-Palestinian are going to renew aid to UNRWA. Another thing I've learned in the peace process is it's usually not about the Palestinians. It's about what Americans want to feel good about themselves, or Europeans want to feel good about themselves. But by feeling good about themselves, they actually cause harm to the Palestinians.
You wrote in your book, Ally, that, and this is one of my favorite quotes from the book, the fantasy of Israel would eventually dissipate, but never the dream. And, you know, Amos Oz famously said that the disappointment from Israel is not in the nature of Israel, it's in the nature of dreams, because dreams fulfilled are always imperfect. And, you know, while Israel may not be a utopia, it's routinely singled out in the media and in the UN by countries that are far worse. So it seems to me that Israel is held to a standard that no other country is held to. Why is that? Is it anti-Semitism?
It's a Jewish state. It's the answer is very simple. We're a Jewish state. Okay, enough said. It's so obvious, so ridiculously obvious. If the Palestinians had any other enemies, the Palestinians have the Syrians as enemies, the Iranians, nobody would ever write a word about them. A word about them. We had 500,000 Syrians killed up the road in recent years. Nobody cared. Nobody cares, okay? Because they're enemies of the Syrians. As a matter of fact, you know how many Palestinians were killed by the Syrians? The Syrian army went into the Palestinian refugee camps out of Damascus and had massacres. Nobody cared. The Palestinians in the West Bank didn't care. There were no protests there against it. So it's saying something. It's about who their enemies are, who their occupiers, quote unquote, are Jews. That is why. But let me go back to the dream and the fantasy. Yeah, the fantasy ended, but the dream of Israel far exceeded my wildest dreams. My wildest dreams. You know, we just had the holidays here at Jaffa, purportedly secular Jaffa. You should have seen the people out dancing in the streets for the Hakafot for Simchat Torah. You should have seen the people, thousands of people came out to the street to hear the Elah at the end of Yom Kippur. What's going on here spiritually, artistically, architecturally, financially, exceeded my wildest dreams. Remember, I came here, was a backwater. It was a backwater. If you would have asked me when I moved here that someday we'd have peace with Egypt and Jordan, I'd say you're crazy. If you would have asked me someday we'd have close relations, we'd have open diplomatic ties with Russia, the former Soviet bloc countries, 12 countries, some of our closest friends in Europe, with China, with India. Israelis coming out of the army couldn't go to India. You get me? That's half of humanity. We didn't have relations with them. You getting me here? If you would have told me that 1 million former Jews from the former Soviet Union would make Aliyah, that over 100,000 Ethiopian Jews would be airlifted here. If you would have told me that the average income of an Israeli would be higher than that of the average Italian and Japanese. If you would have told me, can I go on? That someday we have peace with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, I'd say you're certifiably crazy, okay? Tell me that my dreams haven't been succeeded. Tell me.
That's beautiful. Another thing that you brought up in your book was that unlike in the West, where security is measured in ammunition, security in the Middle East is largely a product of impressions, which is, I know, something that came up a lot during your time as ambassador. Why do you think that concept is so difficult for US leaders to grasp?
I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure it is. I mean, that the progressives who are calling to use Israeli aid as a made, sort of a cutoff of aid, a way of pressuring us understand that the thing we're going to be most afraid of may not be the loss of aid, but the impression it makes in the Middle East of the fact that there is distance between us and our superpower ally. They understand that.
Well, that's a good segue actually to your Tablet magazine article, which posits that US aid may in fact be a threat to Israel. You point out that while the US aid used to comprise half of Israel's defense budget, today that number is 19%. And you talk about this move from a donor to recipient model to a collaborative relationship based on interests and strengths. Can you speak a little bit more?
Well, not that it's going to help, but I actually didn't write that it's going to be a threat to Israel. Tablet did. They put them you should know that when you write an article, they stick.
Yeah, I know how that goes. Yeah,
and it's actually it's not supported by anything in the article that says it's a threat to Israel. Okay, I was the only member of the Israeli government in 2016 who opposed the aid package. It was called the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding of the. I opposed it. I opposed it for a number of reasons, not the least of which that the MOU phased out the 26.3% of that aid that we kept for ourselves. So 100% of the aid will now go to the United States. It's basically an arms subsidy. And they tell us what we can and cannot buy. They tell us to whom we can and cannot sell. But I think the two major points there is, one, the significance of the aid was always much more than monetary. It was that image, okay, that the superpower was behind us. But the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. It's withdrawing from the world, so that it's less significant today. And two, the aid is being used as a sort of a way of beating us over the head by the progressives. And I think that's not the image which we as a sovereign Jewish state in the world's toughest neighborhood, that's not an image we can afford to project. And I ask whether it's worth it for $3.8 billion a year in aid.
That's fair. Yeah, as we discuss U.S. relationships, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up your time as ambassador. I know you dealt with a number of issues, from the prospect of a nuclear armed Iran to unprecedented pressure to stop building and establish settlements. Do you think you could point to, if not then maybe one of the most difficult moments of your ambassadorship, and speak a little bit about that?
Oh, there were so many. There were so many. Probably the most difficult one was in May of 2011. President Obama was set to give a major speech in the State Department the next day on the 20th. And I went to the White House, actually spoke with Tony Blinken, and I was assured that the speech would really not touch on Israel-Palestinian issues. Don't worry about it. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister was flying to Israel for the AIPAC conference. And the president gave the speech the next day, and about 3/4 of it was about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in that speech, the president changed American policy as it existed for 40 years. And without informing the prime minister, not informing me, and Bibi found out about it in the air. And when he landed on the ground, I think you could see the steam coming out of his ears. And that's what led to the famous or infamous lecture in the Oval Office. He was at that, and we had to calm him down. That lecture would have been much worse if he had been left to his own devices. Really had to hold this guy down. It was, one of a long series of betrayals, and just gratuitously mean betrayal.
Do you expect better things from the Biden administration?
I do. I think that they would not. I would like to think so. I just saw what they did to the French, which wasn't much better. So on the submarine issue, so they're capable of betrayal as well. I can't say I got a little bit of schadenfreude for the French. The French didn't seem to mind when the Americans were betraying us, but they seemed to mind when the Americans were betraying them. Now they know what it feels like, but I shouldn't say that online, should I? I'm not in office anymore. I can say what the hell I want, but what was the question again?
By the way, if you don't want that in there, I can cut it out. So
no, it's all right. It's perfect. I don't mind.
The question was, if you're optimistic about U.S. and Israel relationship.
Oh, about Biden. Biden's. I could probably say, even after Bennett's visit, Biden, I have more time to Joe Biden. I know Joe Biden better than any Israeli. I know his staff, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, probably better than any Israeli. They are people who are committed to the U.S.'s relationship. They're not trying to take us down in any way. They are committed to our security, but they are Democrats. They have a platform. That platform includes a two-state solution, and that platform includes the Iran nuclear deal, which is much more serious from our perspective, much more serious.
Yeah. And
I'm not worried about the Palestinian deal. I'm not, because they're not coming to the table anytime soon. So it's kind of a moot point. The Iranians are this close away from their weapon.
what does a good solution in that arena look like?
Iran?
Yeah.
The best solution would be the United States joins with Israel and other like-minded countries in stopping them in every way possible, whether economically or militarily. That's the best solution. I don't believe that Iran can't be stopped. People say it can't be stopped. I think it can be stopped, but depends by whom. I don't want to, shatter anybody's illusions, but the United States has capabilities that we do not have.
Certainly. Moving back to Israeli politics for a second, how does the formation of the Arab Party impact the future? Now that they have a taste of power, will they have a place in future coalitions?
Yeah, I think they'll always will be. I think the elections of 2021 were the most significant elections we've had since 1977, when the Likud overthrew Labor. It was the first time that 21% of the population, the Arab 21%, became part of the political game, and it had reverberations across the political spectrum, particularly for the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. Because in the past, the ultra-Orthodox with 13% of the vote were the swing people. They were the sway voters. They're not anymore. The Arabs are. And it's made the Haredim play politics in a very different way as well. We don't know how this is all going to play out, and it hasn't really been tested. We don't know what's going to happen with the Ram party if Israel has to go to war against Gaza. And by the way, we really could. The IDF just foiled a major bomb plot from Hamas. If that bomb plot had been successful, we'd be at war. We're that close away. And then Ram would have to decide, does the government stay or does it go?
Do you think he'll ever run for prime minister?
Me?
Yeah.
Whenever I'm called to the flag, I'm called to the flag. It's been that way since I was a kid on kibbutz, really. Called the flags. Right now, I'm a candidate to be the chairman of the Jewish Agency. I dealt with that today. That's why I'm wearing this rather fancy shirt. And it's a very tough campaign. There are 9 other candidates. They're very capable candidates. And I'm going on the platform that I've got something more experience than anybody else. Certainly understand American Jewry, certainly diaspora Jewry better than anybody else. And I think that is sort of unassailable, but that's not necessarily what's crucial. I'm also the only candidate that doesn't have a party behind me. I don't have money behind me. I'm running as a complete independent.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to say it's a strange day when the American is dressed down more than the Israeli.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Threw me off a little bit.
It's interesting. As America's become more laid back, we've become more suit oriented. So amazing.
And so I guess as a final question, everyone likes to talk about the Palestinian peace process. And I know you've laid out kind of some of the major roadblocks, namely that there's no one who really represents the voice of the Palestinians who could negotiate on their behalf for something better. What are the conditions that would need to be met? If you could lay a couple of those out for there to be a reasonable chance at something that looks better so that our kids aren't fighting the same wars that we did.
No, I think you'd be fighting the same wars anyway, because you can make a two-state solution tomorrow. And every time we try to actually make peace is when we got the most terror. Second Intifada followed a two-state solution off. The first, the terror wave of the mid 1990s, which my sister-in-law was killed, was followed Oslo. So making peace brings out all the enemies of peace. So don't think you're going to get peace in the way we understand it. But the way to move forward is to give Palestinians the maximum amount of sovereignty that doesn't threaten our security, that enables us to preserve our holy places in Judea and Samaria, such as the Cave of the Machpelah in Hebron, and that would provide for coexistence on the economic and social level. That's it. Will the Palestinians agree to it? Not. I don't know if in my life. I don't know. I'll say the harshest thing I have to say, which is one at the same time probably the most complimentary thing I have to say, and it's this: there are many thousands of peoples in the world. Very few of them are capable of sustaining a state structure. very few of them. One of the remarkable things about the Jewish people is that you can take Jews from 70 different countries who do not share a language, don't share a culture, but share a belief and share a common destiny. And you stick them in a country with no national resources, surrounded by enemies. And we're going to create this. We actually are a people, and we actually are people who are super capable of creating a state structure, a nation state. And people shouldn't forget that just the fact that this place exists is the greatest miracle going.
Well, one final question for you, Michael. A lot of the folks that listen to this podcast are either thinking about or on the way to join the IDF.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to young folks who are on that journey?
Okay. On one hand, this could be the greatest decision you made, the most transformative decision, the most educational decision. But keep in mind, we're not talking about a kindergarten. We're talking about an army. Armies can be unfeeling. They can be bureaucratic. You may not realize your dream of being a commando. You may find yourself driving a Jeep. And armies go to war. And people can come home without limbs from a war. They cannot come home at all. And I've been to enough funerals of lone soldiers, spoken at those funerals, to know that this is deeply and tragically true. Keep that in mind. You know, we have all types of lone soldiers here. We get what's called in Hebrew the Ramboim, people who just want to come and, you know, be tough. We have people who come out of genuine Zionism, want to settle here and see their lives in this. We're different types. Some people are working out difficulties. We get those types too. I created the what was called the lobby for lone soldiers in the Knesset. We held a series of hearings on lone soldiers. So I got to know it very, very, very much up front, from a political level, not just from personal military level. So keep that in mind. Everything I just told you. Being a lone soldier is far, far easier today than it was 45 years ago. Far, far easier. There are today probably close to 8,000 lone soldiers in the Israeli army. That's a brigade size. Okay, there were several dozen back in the 70s. And so there's much support, immense amount of support you get. Probably maybe too much support. Get more pairs of underwear, more pairs of socks than you'll ever need, but a lot of food. And you won't be lonely. But at the end of the day, it's still an army. And it's tough, and it's not about your feelings. Okay, no one's gonna say, "You okay there? You're, you know, how's your mood today?" You know, it doesn't work that way. And keep that in mind.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. And I know you have an interview in 10 minutes, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and
Me too.
I hope we can be in touch again soon.
Be well. Thanks so much, Bert. Bye-bye. Bye.